Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. Our guest speaker now is Mr. Adrian Richardson. Adrian, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. I think if we can sit as near to the front as possible, that will make it less formal and easier for you to ask questions. Thank you for coming. This talk is supposed to be about something to do with education overseas, and I'm not quite certain how that title arrived. We have very little to do with education overseas, although we do, within our group of schools, have one that is overseas, and it's in France, and we started it about 2 or 3 years ago in order to help English children learn French, and that has been so successful that we've expanded it a little bit, and we've taken another small house which we've developed to allow children of a younger age, meaning 9 or 10, to go and spend extended weekends, or indeed perhaps in some cases a whole week, and learn French there and have a French experience. And those are our two overseas enterprises. However, what we are very keen on is education outside the classroom as much as is humanly possible. And if you think back to your own schooling, you probably remember best those things that were least formal, meaning those things that were special, and you went off and you did it somewhere other than in your normal classroom. And we do that in France and in Dorset, in the old Malt House, where we have a link with the Natural History Museum, and we learn science there taught by scientists from the Natural History Museum. And they are teaching children about the extraction of DNA, and we use trees as our first introduction to that exercise. And these scientists come to us from the Natural History Museum down to Dorset, where better could they come, and they gather specimens with each child, they make herbarium specimens, they extract DNA, and they lodge the result on an international website run by the Americans in New York. And so each child's voucher is on an international website alongside the professors from all over the world. And of course the idea is to build up a picture of the world's trees, so that things like the abuse of forests, the cutting down of forests illegally and so on, much easier for people to identify all over the world where that particular piece of timber comes from. And DNA is one of the means of identification. Of course, we have guides produced by the museum, particularly of our little piece of Dorset, and we have computer enhancement. And the way I describe that to you is so huge do the pictures come that you can see the blood of the leaf pulsing around it, and you can detect all the little tiny differences of the leaves from one tree to another, although maybe the same species. So those are the three means of identification that we learn about, and we're expanding those courses to include ferns and seaweeds. So that program will expand and is hugely exciting and interesting and well received by children who love being taught by practicing scientists. So too do the science teachers from the different schools that come down to visit us there. And when they realize who it is that's running these courses, they too are excited by it, and it reminds them of the time when they were not just science teachers in schools, but students of particular aspects of the biological and botanical world. So those two are our main enterprises outside the classroom. Beyond that, we're a collection, a federation of preparatory schools who all join together under one umbrella, one trust, under one governing body, and who all benefit from these different enterprises within the trust. We have Cothill was the original one, which has been a preparatory school since about 1870. And then we have Moden Hall in Northumberland, Ashdown House in Sussex, and two schools much closer to us in Oxfordshire, Chandlings, which is a large day school, and Kitebrook, which is a flexi boarding and day school in the Cotswolds. And this system seems to be a popular one and is gently growing. More and more schools apply to become part of this federation, part of this trust. They keep their colours, they keep their banners, they keep their flags and their individuality, but from an administrative point of view, they're under one umbrella. Now, that really, because we have few people, is the total of my presentation, but I'd like to ask for you to ask me any questions about what I've said, particularly about the idea of learning things outside the classroom. Is there anybody who would like to ask something?
Right, questions from the floor. On any ecological aspects or anything on primary education at, say, one of these schools? Yes, gentleman at the back. Thank you, sir.
How are the classes or the lessons structured? Is it open-ended, or do you have an end of class like we would do normally in an enclosed classroom? It's some form of assessment to indicate that learning is taking place.
Yes, all the schools operate what you might call a traditional curriculum. They're all trying to educate their pupils to graduate to the major schools in this country, be they day or boarding. These things we do outside that curriculum or as part of it, and it has its own assessment. So we do assess, but we don't get marks out of 10. But certainly there is an assessment of the contribution that each child makes, and they keep a journal. And they record what they do, both in France and in the science school in Dorset. So there is a record of what they've done, and we keep specimens, copies of what they achieve there. And of course, what they achieve fits in and supports their curriculum in the schools that they attend. I hope that answers it.
Another question from the floor.
I just wonder if you can tell us something about the structure of the boarding. How are they? What is the routine in the boarding houses, and how they look after?
Yeah, certainly I can. Yes,
thank you very much.
Yes, indeed, of course. It varies. There is no standard answer to your question. It varies from school to school. Some schools will have very small boarding houses set by ages. Others will have much larger boarding houses where there are more people together that are not necessarily arranged on age levels. But in our school, we definitely have it arranged by ages. And in all the schools, I think, that we have in our trust, that is true to say. So that when your child starts, be he 8, 9 or 10, one of those years is probably the most popular. 8 less and less so, 9 and 10 more and more so. He is with a group of the same age in a small dormitory with a matron who looks after him, and he's under the care of the headmaster and the housemaster. So there are plenty of grown-ups helping him and supporting him. I use the word him, her, it could be just as much, but either of them. And they spend their lives in the same dormitories for a term. And then at the end of that term you move, and in all the schools now we have a system whereby there is a certain amount of choice so that you can register who you would like to be with in the next term. It's not guaranteed because, of course, with small children you will realize as well as I, there are all sorts of agendas and you have to be very careful about who's asking to be with whom, but they do have an influence in this, and they are allowed to make preferences and say that they'd like to be with so-and-so and so-and-so, and as far as we possibly can, then we follow that request. They go to bed, depending on their age, of course, any time. The process will start about 6:30, 6:45 if they're very young, and will last about an hour. And then in the morning, when they get up, the process again will probably last about an hour, and it will include showers and all these kinds of cleaning your teeth, getting your shoes clean. At least it used to be in my day. I'm not sure it still is, but all sorts of little domestic things that have to happen in the early morning, and then breakfast. And then there will be a form of assembly. In the more traditional schools, we call that prayers, but it really means an assembly where everybody gets together of all ages, and then from that, out they go to their lessons to study their regular curriculum appropriate to that age group. Outside that, which is the most important bit of it, there are so many different interesting things that each child can do. So, if your little boy wants to, let us say, do archery or spend his time playing football, apart from in the lessons, there are always opportunities for him to do that. And it will be part of an organized club and activity. And all the schools will have a huge range, 20, sometimes more, different activities from which each child may make choices. But again, being very young, very often they need a lot of help with the choice. And they sometimes choose things for which it's too difficult or too hard, and they need somebody to guide them and help them, and the staff within the school will do that. And they'll say something like, well, Johnny, yes, such and such might be something, astronomy might be something you'd be interested in, but shall we try this as a prelude to it, and something which will lead on to it. And of course these lists go home, so the parents can help to guide the child's choice. That is outside all the set lessons and other clubs and hobbies which are available to them. And like most schools, a huge amount of time on games of all sorts. And that, in a sense, is what is most enjoyed very often, the games aspect of it.
Question from the front.
Hi, I'm Catherine Arden. I do theatre workshops for staff training and for children. So my question is, of all the things you offer the children, how does this align itself with PSHE, or does it? Or how do you measure or grade that?
The measurement and grade, personally, is something that I am deeply suspicious of. How do you measure a small child's contribution to what you might call the wider community? You can measure it in terms of giving him praise for what he does or she does, and certainly prospering and supporting that. But there is no attempt to, as it were, turn it into a 6 out of 10 or a 7 out of 10 process. But all these things are linked, and certainly theatre, every form of theatre, be it ballet or the school play or whatever it may be, is the best team game that any of us ever participate in. Because you have your little moment of glory, and you have to get it right or the whole thing collapses. And that little pressure from a very early age, I believe, is a very good thing. So that everybody, however minor the contribution that they're going to make may be, it is crucially important. And that's what they get a sense of pride from when it's done and done successfully. And of course, being the producer of many plays in my life, that's the job of the person who produces the play, to give them that confidence. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you, that does. But just a part B, I think, to that question is in terms of how, with the PSHE compulsory curriculum that we have here in UK with your overseas schools, does that come into it, apart from all just activities?
Yes, it is.
And how do you see the child, or are able to see if the child is progressing in terms of their self-management, of their emotions, of their character, as part of the PSHE?
Absolutely. That's a very interesting aspect of it all. And in a boarding school, the answer is it's very easy. Because the boarding school, almost by definition, is small, so there are very few children that you, the head teacher, are dealing with, so you absolutely understand how this is affecting them and how they are making a contribution in all different aspects. But of course they'll have a formal lesson, if that's the right word, in this, and they will also have a teacher who is responsible for monitoring their progress in this, and that will be part of what you might call a continuing an assessment. You're not marked on it. It's not a kind of 6 out of 10 or whatever, but it is part of a continuing an assessment. And some children need a great deal of support and help with this, and others rise to the occasion and also almost need to be restrained. They want to be so helpful in every sense of that. But yes, it's very much what you might call an intrinsic part of their everyday education. And in day schools, with the day schools we have, it's more formally structured than perhaps it is in some of the boarding schools. Because in a day school, you don't see the children for anything like the length of time, and you don't see them in the variety of situations that you do in a boarding school. I hope that answers it.
More questions from the floor. Adrian, could I ask you a question, picking up on the boarding theme?
Yes.
In the reliable source, the Telegraph, yesterday, it was reported that boarding places demand had gone up by possibly a 6 recently for the prep school age group. And part of this was in place making the prep school fees look rather good value, or very good value, which of course I'm sure you would agree with. But putting it in vis-a-vis the nanny, who can be on 40,000 odd per annum, have you seen this across your spread of schools?
Yes, is the short answer to that. We have. Whether it's connected with the cost of a nanny, I'm not sure. But you're absolutely right. If you compare the costs, and I have a daughter who is a very expensive nanny from time to time, it certainly is true. By the time you've paid their wages, given them a car, given them all the other extra add-ons that they expect, it would be much cheaper to come to Cothill. And that is certainly true. And also far better, because you have an enormous input of hugely dedicated people who are focused on your child in all sorts of different ways. They have plenty of nannies, we call them matrons, but every school has a different term. But that's what effectively they do. And they also have all the education, you could say, thrown in for nothing, because they're getting looked after in a sort of pastoral way by all the non-teaching staff, and then all the lessons, all the input that the teachers have on the games field, in the classroom, and so on and so forth, you could say is a bonus. And now the parental access, since my day, is hugely enhanced, meaning that there is very seldom a week, or certainly not much more than a fortnight passes, when parents have access to their children, either to watch them in a match, or take them out for an exeat, or just come down on some pretext. Granny may be having her 3rd, 80th birthday, or whatever it may be, in order to take the child out and have contact with her. So I think your question is well asked, and it's certainly, I would say, far better value and much cheaper to come to Cothill, or indeed any of the other schools in our trust.
Thank you. Any questions from the floor? It just remains for me to thank you for your questions, and Adrian, thank you very much for sharing your experience with us.
Very kind. Thank you very much for asking me.